Okay, this is 1/4 inch cold rolled steel, cold rolled flat bar. If it was hot rolled, I might go so far as to take a sanding disc to it and knock some of the mill scale off, but it doesn't really have any of that problem on there, just a little spot of rust here and there. And since it's just practice, I'm not worried about it. So tacking them 2 joints up back to back. Don't know how many runs it'll take me to film this, so I want to get prepared for that. I always take a few dry runs, figure out how I'm going to position my hands. And I'm using 0.35 wire, 330 inches a minute, 20.5 volts. Okay, before we get into it, here's a few tips, just a few reminders. Keep your stick out short, and what I mean by short is about 1/2 inch or shorter. Stick out is the distance from the contact tip to the arc. Alright, don't weld cold just for appearance. You got to set this thing hot enough to penetrate. Doesn't matter what it looks like if it's not penetrated. Don't use too much gun angle. I'm using a little bit more than what's needed here just for the sake of filming it. But don't use excessive gun angle. And keep your arc on the leading edge of the puddle. It means use a technique that keeps your arc on the leading edge of the puddle, because not all techniques do. So let's talk about that a little bit further here. See, I'm just using almost just a straight on drag here, but I'm keeping the arc up toward the front, the leading edge of the puddle. That's where the fusion and penetration takes place. You don't want to lay back in the puddle and let that puddle roll ahead. That's where you get cold lap and lack of fusion. Alright, so that's the first bead done there. Now there are techniques that don't keep the arc all the way on the leading edge like this. It keeps it on the leading edge of the toes, doesn't do anything to drive it down into the root of the joint, and then you get lack of fusion, also called LOF, or cold lap, lack of penetration in the root. This is a cross section of that very weld. Whereas keeping it, even just running a straight drag here, but keeping it up in the front like that, results in something more like this, much better. Okay, here's another technique that I use a lot that traces the front of the puddle. I use this a lot. It makes nice little ripples and it works really well. Okay, here's for the second bead now. We're gonna overlap that first bead by about 2/3, not halfway, about 2/3. You'll see what I'm talking about here in just a minute. It's hard to see the exact toe of the weld of the first bead, but I'll try to show it to you in just a second here. You can see a little bit more clearly. That's where the toe of the first weld is. So it's overlapped by a good 2/3. If you only overlap it halfway, you wind up having big low valleys and everything, and you just won't be able to make a nice fillet weld. That's the edge of the weld again. So what we're going to do now for the second bead, or actually the third bead, but the second bead overlaying the root pass, just pretty much going to center up on that trough there, just where that arc and the puddle just kind of centers up on the little groove that I made by welding the first bead. And the second bead generally goes a little slower than the first. There's a little bit more to fill in there. And you also want to keep an eye on that top toe of the weld, make sure you don't leave any undercut. At the same time, you're trying to overlap that bottom bead by about half. Okay, now you can see it was red hot there, so now would be time to let it cool off, maybe dunk it in a quench bucket, something like that. Now, this is just the same from here on out, so I'm going to speed it up for the sake of making a little quicker video. We weld 3 beads over top of that one, trying to do the same thing as we did before. Just kind of align and watch the lines that are around us for reference points. Same settings on the machine. And then the same thing going forward. Just keep on stacking beads on there. This is 4 beads over the 3. Not doing anything different than I did welding 2 over the 1. And that's about it. And that is some excellent practice. Again, we'll put this thing up vertical in a future video, and also overhead.